Welcome to the broadcast tonight, a Charlie Rose special edition. In the 7th episode of our Brain series, we look at the emotional brain.
We're talking, as you outlined so well, about emotions. These are subjective experiences, states of preparedness in response to specific people, situations. We are gathered together with great anticipation of pleasure for this round table that we're going to have tonight. And emotions are designed to enhance our capability for pleasure and to decrease our exposure to pain.
The 7th episode of the Charlie Rose Brain series, underwritten by the Simons Foundation, coming up.
From our studios in New York, this is a special edition of Charlie Rose.
Tonight we continue our exploration of the most complex object in the known universe, the human brain. This evening, the first of two conversations on the science of emotion. Everyone is familiar with such feelings as joy, anger, excitement, and envy. But science is just beginning to understand where these emotions come from and how they control our behavior. This evening, we will focus on how the brain regulates pleasure and reward. The pleasure and reward system involves several different brain regions that communicate using chemical signals called neurotransmitters. This circuit helps us to repeat the behaviors that make us happy while avoiding those that make us miserable. But as any adult knows, pleasure is not always good for you. Tonight, we will also explore a particularly dangerous form of pleasure-seeking, addiction. Long considered to be a moral weakness, addiction is now understood to be a biological disease. Finally, we will explore the role that emotions play in decision-making and social interaction. Next month, in part 2 of the emotional brain, we will turn our focus to negative emotions such as fear and anxiety. Joining us tonight, a group of scientists who have devoted their lives to understanding the emotional brain. Daniel Saltzman. He studies how the brain assigns an emotional value to the information that it receives from the 5 senses. He is an assistant professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at Columbia University. Wolfram Schultz. He studies how the brain's reward systems affect decision-making and learning. He is a professor of neuroscience at Cambridge University and a fellow of the Royal Society. Nora Volkow. Her research into addiction helps us understand drug abuse as a disease rather than a moral weakness. She is a director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse in Washington, D.C. Eric Nestler. Through research on mice, his work has illuminated the molecular basis of drug addiction. He is chairman of the Department of Neuroscience and director of the Brain Institute at Mount Sinai Medical Center here in New York. And once again, my co-host is Dr. Eric Kandel. He is a Nobel laureate, as you know by now, also a professor at Columbia University, and a Howard Hughes medical investigator, and as you also know, a great friend of this series and the man who has helped us understand this miraculous organ. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here, as always.
So as we go through this, as we have gone from understanding visual perception and understanding the developing brain and the aging brain, and now we come to emotion. Tell me what we mean and how does the brain connect to emotion?
Well, as always, you outlined it extremely well. Emotions are a family of subjective experiences, states of readiness that we all experience in response to significant people and situations in our lives. And emotions are designed to enhance our opportunity for happiness and decrease our exposure to misery. It turns out that the first person to really consider the biology of emotion is, in fact, our friend Charles Darwin, the greatest biologist of all time. In the course of his classic work on evolution, he realized that emotion is an extremely important subjective state that is universal. It's shared by people in all cultures, and it's shared by all animals. And this made him focus on the fact that emotions are part of a basic approach avoidance system that is designed, as you indicated, to enhance our opportunity for feeling good and decrease our opportunity for feeling miserable.
And here is the book, Charles Darwin, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, published in 1872.
A remarkable book. And in this book, he points out that in addition to emotions being of personal value, that it enriches our mental life, emotions also have a social function. They convey emotion from one person to another. For example, they're important in mate selection. Moreover, Darwin pointed out that the social aspects of emotion are communicated through facial expression. This book came out in 1872. 2 years earlier, a modification in printing occurred that allowed you to reproduce photographs inexpensively in print. And this book is one of the first books that is literally filled with photographs of various kinds of people in various emotional states. And Darwin was particularly interested in children. He studied his own children very carefully, was curious about their behavior, and it struck him that children express emotions in a particularly pure and powerful form. And here we see approach, happiness, and sadness in a child. And this, of course, raises the question, how do we classify emotion? And Darwin implied, and we now have very good reason to believe, that we classify them along two dimensions, valence and intensity. Here we have valence. So there are anywhere from 6 to 7 emotions, I illustrate 7 here, that range from happiness, that is approach, surprise, disgust, contempt, anger, fear, and sadness. Moreover, for each of these, there are degrees of intensity. So you can be happy very slightly, or you can be deliriously happy. And this is true for each of the emotions. And of course, this raises the question, what is the anatomy of the emotional system? As you indicated, today we're considering positive emotion, and there are 4 structures that are important here. The amygdala, which orchestrates emotion. The striatum, which gets recruited for habit and also for drug of addiction, and they interact with one another. Now, there is cognitive control of emotion, whether it's appropriate to exercise a particular emotional response in this context versus another. That is mediated by a high-level structure called the prefrontal cortex that interacts and in part controls these 2 other structures, the amygdala and striatum. And finally, all of them influenced by a pleasure system, the dopaminergic system in the brain. Now, one of the really striking things about this circuit for emotion, and particularly the dopamine pathway, which is involved in positive emotion, is that it is involved in a number of disease states. So it's disturbed in schizophrenia, it's disturbed in Parkinson's disease, and is co-opted, as you indicated, in addictive disorders. So drug of abuse, such as cocaine and heroin, hijack this system. And one of the great insights that we have in modern biology that you'll hear from Nora Volkow is exactly how this occurs. These drugs simulate the activation of this system. They take it over.
Are there stages of addiction?
There are several well-defined stages of addiction. To begin with, there's the addictive process itself, whereby, as you outlined, people begin to experience an addictive drug, get the pleasure of addiction as this system hijacks the dopaminergic system. And that focus on addiction so consumes their life that they focus on getting the drug and enjoying the drug to the exclusion of all other aspects of their life. They neglect their families, they neglect their jobs, they neglect their health, knowing that they're destroying themselves. They continue to use the drug, number 1. Number 2, as they continue to use it, the dosage that's necessary to give them a high increases. They become tolerant. So the dosage they initially used to give them a high is no longer effective. They need to go to higher dosage. And Nora Volkow documents in a very beautiful series of studies how the striatum, which gets recruited by something like cocaine, no longer responds once the person has used cocaine for some time. And one of the most tragic aspects of addiction is the 3rd phase. There's always the possibility of relapse. So even after a person gives up the use of drugs for weeks, for months, and even for years, exposure to the sight of the drug, the smell of the drug, walking the street in which they used to buy the drug or bumping into people that use the drug brings a tremendous urge to use the drug back to them. As a result of this, very, very easy for people to relapse and to start using these drugs again. And this is why we realize that addiction is a lifelong disease. It can never be cured. People can be helped with it, but they have to be monitored throughout their whole life. And you would think a process like this is extremely difficult to study. The fact is we've made quite good progress in understanding it through two quite different avenues. First of all, we can study it in people using imaging techniques. And Nora Volkow has pioneered this. We could also study it in experimental animals. We can study it in monkeys, as Daniel Salzman and Wolfram Schutz has done. We can study it in rats and mice, as Eric Nestler has done. And we can even study it in flies, as a number of other people have done. So there are a number of experimental approaches to studying addiction. We're now beginning to get some insight in how it works.
Okay, why are we dividing emotion into two parts? I mean, it's a nice, neat division between pleasure and reward and fear and anxiety, but why this division?
It's a very rich subject, and there are different diseases associated with positive and negative emotion. We spoke about the positive emotion. Addiction is the prototypic example that co-opts the positive emotion system. We now have a large number of veterans coming back from Iraq that suffer from excessive negative emotion. A memory of seeing a friend get killed in battle right next to them, of seeing wounded people all around them, of being wounded themselves, of having shells explode around them. These people come back with a disorder called post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a remembrance of a frightening episode. So the fear stays with them for a long period of time. And in the next program, we're going to discuss in detail negative emotion, the role of the amygdala in both of these emotions, in negative as well as positive, the cortical control systems from this, and the fact that we can now begin to treat post-traumatic stress disorder in a remarkably effective way, and we're going to discuss the treatment of this disorder.
All right, here is our first of 2 hours on emotion, in which we look at pleasure and reward with our panel. Tell me about emotions and some sense of the variety of emotions.
So this is the challenge for neuroscientists in general. When you move on to mental processes, to be able to study mental processes that can vary enormously in many dimensions, right? And emotion is an example of that, because we have a very rich language for being able to describe different types of emotion. And the question then becomes, for neuroscientists, is how do you take different emotions, such as disgust, anger, joy, happiness, and how do you map them into brain circuits to be able to understand how those brain circuits function, right? So that's the starting point. All of us are psychologists to some extent at the beginning, in order to be able to understand how to map these linguistic terms into processes that might actually be represented in the brain. And there's at least two components of emotion that are critical for understanding in that regard. And one is that everyone knows what an emotional experience is like, but if you think about it for a minute, it has both a conscious component and an unconscious component. And then, so if you think about that, what does it mean? It means that there are certain aspects of our emotional responses that are automatic, that are happening without us even thinking about it. And there have to be brain systems then that are operating below the level of our consciousness that would execute those processes. At the same time, we have conscious feelings of emotion and awareness of those emotions. And we have to come up with ways of understanding how the brain could be then modulating emotion in a way that would influence our conscious awareness of them. So that's one aspect of trying to understand emotion, is to be able to understand the divide between conscious and unconscious processing in the brain.
That's really a very interesting example, because maybe you can give a specific example of that. If you have a lion all of a sudden coming into this room, we would be prepared to run away before we specifically perceive that it's a lion. So we have a physical response to it, knowing we're in a dangerous situation before we even perceive what the specific nature of the threat is.
So it's not just that we want to flee, it's that there's a whole range of other bodily responses that happen. Our heart will start to race, we'll start sweating a little bit. So there's aspects of the response mediated by our nervous system that are automatic, happening below the level of consciousness, and they are part of our emotional experience. And for decades, scientists have sort of debated in a chicken and egg fashion which comes first, those kinds of physiological responses in response to stimuli, or the conscious awareness of those physiological responses. So this conscious-unconscious divide is a big issue in terms of defining emotions, but there's another aspect of emotion that Eric touched on a little bit earlier, which is that despite our very rich language for describing emotions, you can actually map many aspects of these emotions onto two axes. One of them has to do with how good or bad something is, the valence of the emotion.
Right.
And the other has to do with the intensity, right? So you can get really excited when you're in a very fearful state, and you can get really excited when you're in a very happy state, right? So the valence there is different, but the intensity is similar. And so you have these two axes, which actually you can map most emotions onto those two axes in some way. I'm not saying that it captures the entire essence of that particular emotion, but you can reduce the emotional experience to those two axes in a very useful way in terms of looking at brain systems.
Maybe you take us a little bit through the anatomy of the emotional system.
Right. So we were talking about different aspects of emotion that needs to be coordinated in the brain. And the first slide is giving you a window on some of these key structures. This is a lateral view of the human brain. So your cover of the brain is the cerebral cortex. I think you've seen that before in prior subjects. And you've talked about the hippocampus, which is a structure buried in the medial temporal lobe and is involved in learning and memory. And Eric had mentioned earlier in the introduction to the show that a key coordinator of emotion is the amygdala, which sits just anterior to the hippocampus there. And the amygdala is thought to be a key coordinator of emotion because it sends projections both to subcortical structures that modulate some of the different physiological responses we were discussing, such as heart rate and how sweaty you are when you're nervous and things like that, that are part of the automatic or unconscious aspect of emotional experience. And at the same time, the amygdala also sends projections up to the cerebral cortex, including a prominent projection up to the thinking part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which may well mediate exactly how emotion can influence different aspects of cognition. Now, some of the other structures that have been mentioned already were dopamine neurons, as well as the striatum, which is another target of dopamine neurons. And we'll be discussing all four of those structures throughout the show. Now, emotion, of course, needs to be regulated. And in the regulation of emotion, that's thought to happen in part by communication that comes from the prefrontal cortex back down to the amygdala, as shown here. So these are the structures that we're going to be talking about. And dopamine actually broadcasts its signal broadly throughout the cerebral cortex. So you can see here dopamine neurons, which have very prominent projections up to the prefrontal cortex, up to the striatum, and it even projects nicely to the amygdalas as well. So it's in a position to broadcast some kind of information. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the information related to rewards and reward prediction today, to wide parts of the wide aspects of the brain.
Wolfram, how do rewards come into this?
Yeah, well, I think rewards are a basic component that will lead in one way or another to emotions. So the standard view, of course, is rewards make you happy. But in neuroscience, we have a little bit a wider view. We need to cast our net a bit wider. So we think that rewards are basically all objects that make us approach behavior. That means that we approach, that we want to spend energy on. Rewards make us learn things. Then how did rewards enter neurobiology? It's obviously a very general concept, and even if we try to scale it down a little bit with these examples. In the 1950s, Olds and Milner did a very famous experiment, and a series of experiments, in which they put small wires into the brains of little rats, and the rats would push a lever to produce a current to their brain. The current is so weak you wouldn't sense it even as a tickle on your skin. And the rats would press a lever over and over and over again to just have that electrical stimulus inside their brain. It's not just anywhere. It was in particular parts of the brain where you have to do that. And then the rats, it was so strong, this kind of approach behavior and this behavior generating power of that electrical stimulus, they would stop eating, they would stop drinking, they would stop having sex, they would basically die. Actually, they would die if you would let them go on and stimulate. They wouldn't eat, even if the food is there.
So the pleasure was so great that they would sacrifice everything.
More pleasurable than anything else they'd experienced. A remarkable set of experiments.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. Yeah. That's it. I mean, they're kind of...
Just as an aside, Peter Milner, who together with Olds discovered this is the husband of Brenda Muller.
I was going to... Yes, Brenda was here last time, and
Oh, yes.
remarkably
It
so.
may go beyond pleasure, though, in that it's not just pleasure. There's something about this stimulus that prompts you to repeat it again.
Yeah. Now, what would that be, though?
I think that remains unknown.
that's a
and
question.
I think that's something that you're going to address,
well,
Wolfram.
I think this is what we call the reward predicting stimulus. So we'll get to that in a minute. Then the question was, I mean, what brain systems are these that you stimulate? You could, of course, look at your electrode and see where it is, and it was actually in the brainstem where it is quite, or in the anterior midbrain, where it's actually quite complicated to find the individual brain structures. And then came the revolution in neurotransmission, in chemical neurotransmitters. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, a number of neurotransmitters were identified, including one that it's called dopamine. So dopamine is a chemical that serves as a neurotransmitter and is located in neurons, released from neurons that have identified anatomical positions in the brain. So the dopamine neurons project to the striatum, to the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and to a few other brain structures. These are the most important ones. And then it turned out that the manipulation of the dopamine neurotransmission by giving dopamine antagonists and other substances would modify reward-seeking behavior. And in particular, it was found out, like by people like Roy Wise and associates and other people, that the electrical stimulation for brain reward was partly related to the dopamine neurons. In fact, stimulating the dopamine neurons meant that the animal would repeat that electrical stimulation. It was like getting a reward.
Tell us about addiction.
At the essence, of course, of addiction is why do people take drugs? And they take drugs because they want to feel good. And drugs make you feel good, and they make you feel good, as Eric was mentioning, because they hijack this reward system. All of the drugs of abuse that we know that can make people addicted increase dopamine in the pleasure centers of the brain. And that is believed to actually be crucial for producing the rewarding effects and to ultimately lead to the changes that result in addiction. Now, with imaging technologies, we can actually now go inside the brain of a person that's addicted to drugs and see what areas of the brain may be disrupted that could explain why is it that a person that's addicted to drugs cannot control the urge to take the drug, even though they actually can tell you sometimes they are no longer even pleasurable anymore. They were pleasurable initially, but as they repeat the taking of the drugs, that pleasure becomes less and less, and they start to take it not to get high, but just to feel normal. So with imaging, for example, we can now look inside a human brain and see, there you have a diagram that shows this famous dopamine cell. Normally, you cannot look at them. You require an imaging technology that relies on radioactivity. And the way that you're going to be looking at how drugs increase dopamine is the following way. Normally, you have dopamine cells, releases dopamine when you take a drug, for example, and dopamine sends this message by binding to the receptors. You take a radioactive compound that actually binds exactly to the same receptors as dopamine, but can only bind when the receptors are not occupied by dopamine. So that allows you to take an image, and then you bring the subject back and you test them when they are taking a drug like cocaine. Cocaine interferes with dopamine removal from this space, and those dopamine occupies all of the receptors in such a way that when you give your radioactive compounds, the receptors are occupied, and your radioactivity cannot no longer bind. And so you see that decrease in radioactivity, which is really a function of the fact that the drugs are increasing dopamine. So you can now use exactly this technology to go inside the brain of a person that's addicted and a person that's not addicted, and to compare their brains when you give them a drug. And this is what you see there. For example, to the left is a placebo. It's a saline solution. And you see a lot of radioactivity in the center, which is the striatum, which is one of the main reward areas of the brain is. And then you see the drug, and you see the decrease in radioactivity because dopamine went up. To the surprise of everybody, including us, when we gave it to people that are addicted, we saw almost no signal. And this is antithetical, because you say then if the drug is not so effective in increasing dopamine, and we take drugs to feel good, and that relates to increasing dopamine, then what is it in the logic? And what we found actually was very, very intriguing and very telling, but very malignant vis-a-vis the process of addiction. And it's something that Wolfgang Ham actually described many years ago, which is once the brain learns that a certain stimuli produces reward, it stops increasing dopamine with that stimuli and instead increases dopamine when there is a stimuli associated with it that predicts that you're going to get reward. That's what we call conditioning, and that was what Pavlov described with his dogs.
Right.
The sound predicted to the animals they were going to get
The sound of the bell.
Exactly, yes.
Right.
Well, the same thing is happening in addiction. The people that are addicted to drugs are increasing dopamine when they see the needle, when they see the person that they had the drugs before, in the neighborhood where they actually have been. So look at the images in the next slide, which actually show, in the left, people just looking at the neutral video. This is nature scenes.
Right.
And to the right, these are cocaine abusers, the same cocaine abusers, but now they are not looking to nature scenes. They are looking to a video that shows people taking cocaine. You see the radioactivity has gone down because dopamine goes up. So you see that stimuli, the conditioned stimuli, are increasing dopamine in the striatum, and that is subjectively associated by these individuals with a tremendous desire to take the drug. And you can then start to understand why is it so very difficult to a person that is trying to stop drugs to go back to their environment, because everything reminds them of the drug. Everything is conditioned. So this is an automatic behavior that's going to result in the wanting of more drug.
This came up a few years ago when billboards were around showing lines of white powder and a razor blade as a way to get people to stop doing cocaine. And we found that stimulus provided an incredibly strong cue to remind people of these positive memories.
So when they saw that visual image there,
it actually induced craving.
It induced craving when they saw the symbol.
A very interesting study that was done, I guess, about 10 or 15 years ago with the veterans from Vietnam who had gotten hooked on very effective heroin, very high-quality heroin. And the amazing thing was they got addicted in Vietnam, but they could give up the addiction when they came to the United States because the clues that they had that encouraged them to use the drug were gone.
No longer part of their
Here,
life.
the average addict walks out and sees the same. This is the guy that sold it to me. This is the drugstore nearby where I met him. And he's reminded of the things that trigger this response. So obviously we're learning a lot about imaging. Can we learn anything from animal models about this?
Yes, absolutely. Most advances in modern medicine have come about through the use of animal models, where aspects of a human disease are recreated in a laboratory animal like a rat or mouse. A major obstacle in psychiatry has been the unique difficulty in generating animal models, since so many psychiatric symptoms are inaccessible in animals. Hallucinations, guilt, suicidality.
You can't find them.
And so on, absolutely. In this context, addiction has particular promise because it is far easier to model in an animal than other psychiatric conditions. So, under the right circumstances, a rat or mouse will choose to self-administer and addict itself to the same range of drugs that people self-administer and addict themselves to.
This is very interesting because this is also true for fearful conditions. Anxiety states can also be modeled. And this is essentially what Darwin said. These emotions are conserved, and so one can study these emotional disorders very effectively in animals.
Absolutely. And the self-administration behavior in animals, like in humans, is determined roughly half by an individual's genetic constitution and half by environment. So we know, for example, that chronic stress will increase an animal's vulnerability to self-administer a drug of abuse, just as we see in humans. And going back to a point that Wolfram made earlier, if a subset of animals, if given unlimited access to a very potent drug like cocaine or heroin, will actually overdose and kill themselves.
Where is conscious control in all this?
Well, I think this is a complex interplay between conscious and subconscious processes, as Dan had mentioned. It initially starts with a conscious decision to obtain drug. For the rat, it means pressing a lever.
Right.
But what we've been talking about is then that drug stimulus activates these subcortical signals, like the dopamine-containing nerve cells, that are subconscious and then over time can take over.
Nora, tell me about cognition and emotion.
Well, you know, it's interesting because cognition has been traditionally situated in the prefrontal cortex. But we've also come to realize that drugs erode that function of the prefrontal cortex, and that with repeated drug use, actually, the frontal cortex loses its ability to cognitively control your desires and emotion. Each one of us, on any one given day, they have to make decisions of whether we do something we want to do or we restrain. I want that very much, but I'm not going to do it because I want that chocolate, but I don't because I don't want to gain weight. Sometimes I can control and sometimes I cannot. Most of the time I can. In people that are addicted chronically to drugs, that control becomes very difficult. And it's almost for them like I like to sort of use the metaphor of the brakes of the brain, the one that are exerting cognitive control. The person that is addicted to drugs does not want to take the drug. It costs them their job, they may end up in prison, their spouse, and yet they cannot stop it. So it's like you're driving, you want to stop, but if you don't have brakes, you won't be able to do it. Yeah. And that is the prefrontal cortex.
The producer Peter showed me a passage from John Cheever talking about drinking. You know, and he looked at his notes, and he knew that drinking was not good for him. And how many times he said, I've got to stop, I've got to stop, I've got to stop. And yet he said, the next day at lunchtime, I find myself taking a bottle of whiskey out.
It is a powerful habit.
That's right. It's some of the same neural circuitry we've been talking about. But now it becomes hijacked, and it actually mediates a formation of habits that are very maladaptive. So this is now meant to represent, in part, some of the key structures and their connections in relation to habit formation. And so, as Wolfram has described earlier, dopamine neurons are providing information about reward, in particular about when a reward or a stimulus is better than expected, right? And you know, if you think about a good habit, a habit that is adaptive, we all want to form habits when they're adaptive for us and they help us survive because we can basically perform those behaviors automatically without thinking about it, and it's very helpful. It's more efficient, right? So that can be driven in part by the output from a dopamine neuron, because when something happens that's better than expected, you want to keep repeating that kind of behavior. And so it's dopamine input into structures like the striatum and the prefrontal cortex that probably mediate the normal formation of adaptive habits. At the same time, when these become hijacked during drug-seeking behaviors, what happens is that a particular cue can elicit drug craving, which then in turn will elicit drug-seeking behavior. And this is mediated probably by circuitry that involves both dopamine neurons, but the convergence of dopamine input and input from the amygdala into the striatum.
So is this where we talk about free will?
One of your specialties.
Yeah, well, I mean, it has come up already in the discussion that this drug addiction kind of takes you over. So, of course, I mean, you give up a part of your free will when you become addicted, whether that's conscious decision or whether that happens.
You've lost your free will.
You lost a good part, well, a certain part of your free will. But before we get to that stage of addiction, I mean, I can't live without having that water. Actually, not that one, but some water. Every so many hours. So, I mean, the rewards have a powerful effect of attracting your behavior, and this is already a constraint on your free will. The simple fact that we need liquids in the environment, that we need to reproduce, makes us lose part of our free will. We still have the choice between different alternatives, but we're going in one direction. And that is towards getting the reward and avoiding negative consequences. That's very clear. And then the other thing that we found is that the dopamine neurons not only signal the reward or signal the reward whenever it is better than what you had received before, they also signal the risk. So risk also influences your free will behavior. And the other thing that risk does is that you have a problem understanding the world. If the world is risky, it could either be because you don't know it enough, or because there is inherent risk, like the weather forecast. We think the weather is basically random, but we understand now that better meteorology makes us predict the weather better. So we have reduced the risk by knowledge, by experience, by science. So if you don't have that, if you don't have the science, we are getting superstitious. We say, well, if I go three times around that tree, it will not rain tomorrow, and I can bring in my harvest. things like this. The more we know about the world, the better we understand risk, and I think the less we will get superstitious about how certain things will happen. And so this is something where we would say the education and the science is actually there to reduce superstitions and make us behave in a more rational manner.
The discussion of free will is a difficult one, though, because I think we all believe that individuals must be responsible for their decisions.
That's where I was going.
And the bottom line is that drug addicts make bad decisions. The difficulty comes in with the fact that the drugs are targeting the very parts of the brain that control our ability to make those decisions. And so we have to balance, and I think Nora would agree, we have to balance between looking at an addict from the concept of free will, responsibility, yet they do have a drug-induced disease in their brain.
These are not bad people, these are sick people.
Yeah.
People are addicts. Can we do anything about this? Are there any treatment approaches that are effective?
Absolutely. One of the vital challenges of today is to translate the increasing knowledge we've gained of brain reward circuits, the regions of the brain that Dan mentioned earlier, and an increasing understanding of the way that drugs change the brain at a molecular level into better treatments. The best treatments today are behavioral, things like 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous. But recidivism is high. A large majority of addicts return to using drug even after a few months of completing the best available program. Our view is that the goal of medication treatments would be to help counteract these powerful biological forces that drive an addiction and thereby make rehabilitation and psychosocial efforts that much more effective.
Wouldn't you say the behavioral treatments are really changing the brain?
Yes. Both.
So this 12-step program is in fact changing the brain?
Yes, even though we think oftentimes about behavioral therapies and medication treatments is very different, they both work through biological processes. In other words, they would both produce positive changes in the brain.
So in the end, there's a biological behavior at both ends?
Yes.
A biological consequence at both ends?
It's like you're training the prefrontal cortex to be able to regulate these habits, basically.
Yeah, no, and I wanted the point that I do want to make when we speak of addiction as a disease of the brain is that it's a chronic disease, and so when we're dealing with treatments, we need to consider it as a chronic model of disease. And I want to make it emphasize because it was very frustrating for me when I were trying to get insurances to pay for treatments of substance abuse, and they say treatment does not work, and it does not work because 70% of patients relapse. Well, they relapse because you discontinue treatment. We have the magical thinking that we're going to cure addiction. Currently, we do not cure addiction. We treat it like so many other chronic diseases, hypertension, asthma, cancer. And you have to maintain treatment, otherwise the patient relapses. So the concept of high relapse rates is part of the concept of the long-lasting changes.
Absolutely.
Drugs affect the brain for a period that's much longer after you stop taking it, and therefore the importance of maintaining treatment. And we do have some good medications. For example, in the case of heroin, we have methadone and buprenorphine. For the case of nicotine, we have several alternatives for
Which
cigarette
give you the
smoking.
same, what do they do, all of those, as a category? Whether it's nicotine or whether it's methadone?
For methadone and buprenorphine and for nicotine replacement, you have drugs that are acting in the same molecular targets in the brain as the drugs themselves, but they do it in a different way, temporarily a much lower level of stimulation.
A heroin addict, for example, would spend most of his or her day trying to get heroin and taking it, and then the drug wears off and then the process starts all over again. Methadone binds to the same receptor that is being activated by heroin, only it stays on the receptor for a very long period of time. So a person's life can gradually get back to normal.
But then do you have
break these habits.
do you have then a methadone addiction or not?
You do, but it's not as disruptive, and it allows normal life to begin to occur.
One of the things that emerges from this discussion is how discriminated the addictive person is.
Right.
For example, drug companies spend practically no effort trying to develop effective drugs against addiction.
And that is correct. And it's actually, as a result of that, it has been very difficult. All of the science that Eric was telling us about has translated in some very potentially promising targets for medications.
Right.
But to bring them from the laboratory into the clinic is a very costly. And for most of the diseases that we know about, those costs are carried by the pharmaceutical industry. In the cases of addiction, the pharmaceutical industry has not been very much involved with the treatments for addiction.
Why is that?
And one of them is the stigma that Eric was speaking about. Another one is the perception that the person that is addicted to drugs is not going to be able to provide for the cost, the economic
They
cost
think that
of
most
such.
people who are addicted, which is not true, are people on the street. But you also have people who are addicted in major executive positions throughout the
Universities,
country.
everywhere else. Are we at a point in which most people believe that addiction is a disease?
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's not simply a weakness of character.
I think Nora has been one of the people who's been making this clear to the
I
general
understand,
public.
but have you won the battle?
But, well, that's where it comes. You're asking me and I say yes. But when I ask that to physicians or to lay physicians, let's put that are the most knowledgeable about this, I ask them and they say yes, but. And
But-
that's where you have they accepted it. They intellectually have accepted it, but it has not changed their behavior, which is the healthcare system, for the most part, has really removed itself from the screening and the treatment of the substance user. So, and the reason that it is the but is because it is believed to be a behavioral choice, a choice of the individual when they start taking drugs. And that has been used to stigmatize the problem of drug addiction. But it's not fair, because if you look at the numbers in the United States of kids that get exposed to drugs, 40% of kids 18 to 19 years of age have been exposed once in their lifetime to marijuana. 75 or more have been exposed to alcohol. And yet, some of them will become addicted and others will not, approximately 10%. And that is not something that you choose. That's genetically determined.
Okay, what comes under the umbrella of addiction? Drugs, everything from what to heroin, cocaine, alcohol, food?
There is a lot of interest right now in terms of considering certain compulsive behaviors as addiction, like compulsive eating, compulsive gambling, compulsive sexual behaviors.
They are addiction in the same way that do you think that there may be?
Behaviorally, the
Gambling.
phenotype is very similar. And we actually have been doing studies comparing the brains of people that are addicted with comparing them with people that are obese to try to understand whether the same striatal dopamine circuit is involved. And long and behold, it shouldn't be surprising, but it was surprising to us at the beginning how similar the changes are in these two conditions. And it's not surprising because drugs are hijacking a circuit in the brain that evolved to ensure that we had behaviors that would allow us to survive. What are those? They are reproduction, they are food. Drugs basically take them
One of the,
over.
one of the great hopes that emerges out of this is society is more willing to accept obesity as a disease than it is drug addiction. And getting insight into how to prevent obesity, which is an addictive behavior on a certain level, might spread and give us insight through the development of drugs for other kinds of addictive diseases.
Before we say that the addiction involves the same brain centers for these different forms of addiction, like food and drugs and money, we can at least say here already, at the completely unaddicted state, that this same part in the brain called the striatum shows response, is activated by all kinds of different rewards, like money, beautiful faces as opposed to standard faces, sports cars as opposed to standard cars, pleasant music as opposed to background music, humorous comic strips as opposed to informative comic strips, and also romantic love. I mean, this is the people see pictures of a partner with whom they have fallen in love within the last half year, and that activates the striatum more compared to seeing a picture of a person that they have gotten to know since half a year. So all these areas, all these different rewards seem to activate the striatum. Now you understand that addiction is an exaggerated form of brain response and behavioral response to rewards, and you can imagine if this is already the same parts in the brain that's activated with the rewards, that the addiction could have certain similar anatomical components.
This is the hijacking idea.
And that's the hijacking idea. So it's no surprise that the food reward and maybe the drug reward or something have certain similar components.
There also are some hopeful things. For example, there's reason to believe that there are stages in drug abuse, that certain drugs are more likely to lead to other drugs. Smoking, for example, is a powerful first step. And as one discourages people from smoking, and that's beginning to happen, it's quite likely will have an effect on other sorts of addictive processes as well.
Yeah, and I actually, Eric's wife, Denise, had been instrumental with her work in looking at epidemiological studies to actually show that kids that were engaging in illicit substances had started by taking nicotine. So the question was, is it because that was the first drug that was available, or is it because those kids that are going to take illicit substances will take nicotine, or is nicotine doing something in your brain, which is really interesting, that could then make you more vulnerable as you grow into an adult to other substances and to addiction. And there is evidence from studies in laboratory animals that indeed early exposure to nicotine modifies the function of the dopamine cells, making them less sensitive to reinforcers, to rewards. And so, yes, nicotine exposure early on can have longer lasting effects, certainly in laboratory animals, that will affect the way that you're going to be responding to drugs.
It's on everybody's mind because of all the stuff that's gone on in the last 4 or 5 months about Tiger Woods, the idea of sex addiction. What do we know about that?
The Coolidge effect, that a male exposed to a female will after a while tire of copulating with that female. But if you show him another female, that same male who appears exhausted will all of a sudden be capable of sexual activity.
And why is that? What happens in the brain to make that true?
There is some habituation going on, familiarity, which no longer is as reinforcing. It's very much like addiction.
Right, expected rewards lose their value over time.
But it made me also smile because it's the same thing with food. With food, you can actually, if they put you a piece of meat, you can tire of it, but then they bring dessert, even though you're told you'll eat a dessert.
Yeah. All right.
Anything that is novel will be salient and will activate the dopamine system. So that's why it's not surprising
so
that
say
you
that
have
again. Everything gets tired at some point and activates the dopamine.
Tolerant. So a stimuli that's pleasurable, a natural stimuli, will activate the dopamine cells. But as you become satiated, as you repeat it, that same stimuli stops.
Yeah. Right.
Not with drugs. And actually, that's one of the very...
Now, why is drugs different?
You do not become satiated.
Is it possible that part of the addiction is to risk?
That's exactly right. And I think that's one thing that characterizes the behavior of people that take enormous risk in having, say, multiple sexual partners, right? So it's not just the sexual satisfaction, it's the risk and enjoyment that they get from doing it in dangerous situations, right? And Wolfram has already spoken a little bit about how risk can actually activate dopamine neurons. And so this danger can maybe even accentuate the sense of pleasure that they get from these types of activities.
And the interesting thing is that some of the same reward neurons, like the dopamine neurons, are also activated by risk. And the other brain structure that we know that responds to risk very well, to stimuli that predict the risk, is the orbitofrontal cortex. These are not the same neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex that code reward, but it's the same area, so they're very close by.
There's another interesting feature. Eric Nessler has shown in experimental animals that as you become addicted, there are anatomical changes in your brain, just as you see with learning. So therefore, the chance of doing it again are increased. And this is probably the case with risk as well. We don't have the data there, but probably as you engage in this and you're successful with it, you're encouraged to try it again and again.
In every episode that we have done, we've devoted a portion of it to genes. Is there less evidence here of the genetic connection?
Addiction is roughly half genetic, which is actually an astounding figure based on how the role of psychosocial factors contribute to addiction as well. Yet it's 50% genetic. That's as heritable as high blood pressure,
and they
high
can
cholesterol.
identify the genes?
No, that's the problem. That's what Nora was mentioning.
It's been very difficult.
We are just
so
now
far.
getting the techniques in molecular biology that would enable us to find these genes. We're beginning that.
Yeah, but in animals you can do something that's very neat, which is actually modify one gene, and that dramatically modifies the vulnerability of that animal to take the drug and to compulsively ingest it. So with one gene, you can dramatically change the vulnerability of an animal to drugs. just illustrating how important these genes are, obviously in determining the way that we're going to respond to drugs. And again, this is not surprising. Just when you go out with your friends and go to dinner and have a glass of wine, you can rapidly see how differently we all respond to the same drug. And that the reason why we're responding differently is part of it is your biology, your genetics.
Yes, it is indeed true. Let me go to what you do at the National Institute of Drug Abuse.
Yeah.
What are you doing there? What's the goal and what's the support you have from the government?
Well, the Institute funds researchers in order to advance the knowledge of in drug abuse and addiction such that we can prevent and treat the drug addiction in this problem. I always say my simple task is to get people that are very, very bright and to be able to give them the resources so that they can use their brains and actually come up with solutions to the problem. So we focus in two major areas. How can knowledge help us prevent? How can knowledge help us treat drug abuse and addiction through science? And that involves, of course, very basic science, like the work that you're hearing today, but also it involves a better understanding about what practices are going to be more effective, which we currently have, for which there is knowledge. There is knowledge, and yet we're not applying them. So what practices are more likely to prevent and treat people such that we can decrease the significant burden of drug abuse in this country?
All right, let me conclude with this, which Eric knows I like to do. In research, in the study that you do, what is the one question you would like to see answered?
How can we cure addiction?
Free will.
Free will.
Identifying specific genes that control vulnerability or resistance to addiction.
Learning how the prefrontal cortex can regulate our emotions.
I'm interested in learning and memory, and addiction is in fact the learning process. We've recently begun to explore a molecule that is involved in the perpetuation of memory storage, and it would be interesting to know whether it's involved in the perpetuation of addictive process. Why people relapse so easily. They can be off drugs for months, but they walk out in the street, they see a sign, boom, it's like a conditioned stimulus, they go back, being addicted again. I would like to see whether this kind of a molecule is involved in that as well.
What do you think we'll be talking about 10 years from now if we convene the same group to talk about the emotion in the brain?
Emotion is an area that we knew very little about in biological terms 20 years ago. We've made remarkable progress. So I think this is an area in which the progress will be disproportionately large. I think we'll have a much better understanding of the reinforcing systems of addiction. We may have some initial insights into how to combat addiction, and we'll see how obesity and drug addiction relate to each other. So many of the themes that we outlined here we'll make progress on. Having said that, I should tell you, in biological terms, 10 years is a very short period of time.
And I think we would also have a better knowledge about conscious versus unconscious emotions. Because so much of our behavior is controlled by unconscious processes, including unconscious emotions.
This is what Freud said.
No. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
That's what Freud
yes,
said.
Sir.
Right.
Nobody
Yeah,
believes
that's
this stuff,
That's what
and
Freud
he's
said.
right.
So there is our panel weighing in on part one of our two-part look at emotion and the brain. Part two is?
Negative emotion. We're going to discuss fear and disorders related to fear. We're going to focus in particular on post-traumatic stress disorder, and there is good news about this disorder. There are now a number of rather effective treatments, both behavioral treatments and psychopharmacological treatments, that are extremely effective in helping people
So
with
there is a
post-traumatic
biological basis of post-traumatic
stress
depression.
disorder. That's right. That's right.
Thank you for joining us for this. We look forward to seeing you next time. Emotion Part 2, Fear and Anxiety. See you then.